Hello and welcome to week number 11 in plant biology here at NICC. This week we are back to the Concepts of Biology textbook, and we are starting our conversation over the next few weeks talking about taxonomy and phylogenetics, which is really the study of the relationships of organisms to one another. And this, not surprisingly, is an important component when we're looking at plants as well. So our reading for this week is going to consist of chapters 12 and 13 in the Concepts of Biology OER textbook, so 12 and 13. And these are, again, covering diversity of life, and then we're going to start talking specifically about diversity of microbial life, fungi, and protists, which might not seem necessarily germane to plant biology, but all of those organisms play significant roles in the ecology and life histories of plants, and so knowing at least some introductory material about those organisms and how they interact in their world and environments is important. So chapter 12, again, covers introduction to the diversity of life. And when we're talking about the diversity of life, we're really concerned about how we organize our understanding of how organisms are related to one another, and then how do we go about and determine those evolutionary relationships? And that's really what this chapter covers. So when we're starting out looking at this chapter, we can see in figure 12.2 that they provide this phylogenetic tree of life. So this branching sort of diagram really shows how a number of different organisms are related to one another. And we can see that we have these three main domains, three main domains of life. We have the bacteria and the archaea, which are these prokaryotic life forms, which are very simple single-celled organisms, and then we have this other branch, which are known as the eukarya, or so these eukaryotic organisms. And this branching between the bacteria and the archaea as prokaryotes and the eukaryotic organisms, which are known as eukaryotic organisms, is a significant branch, and plants fall firmly into the eukaryotic organisms, and much in the same way that humans are eukaryotic organisms. So if you take a look at that diagram, they really sort of lay out where these different organisms fall along this evolutionary path and within these family sorts of relationships. I mean, these are very broad sort of kingdom relationships, but where they fall in to one another. So we can see, for example, that we have filamentous green bacteria in the bacteria group, so that's going to be a photosynthetic organism, but it's a prokaryotic photosynthetic organism. It's not closely related to the plants, which are over on the eukaryotic side. You can see that off to the right. They share some similar sorts of characteristics. They would both be photosynthetic, but they are not closely related. So when we're talking about the phylogenetics of organisms, we're looking at how closely related they are to one another. When we're talking about phylogenetics, we're going to talk about the levels of classification, or where in this hierarchy do things fall. And so we can talk about the domain. Again, we have these three main domains: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. The next level down after domain are what are known as kingdoms. Each of these domains contains a number of kingdoms, and then within the kingdoms there are these sequentially sort of smaller and smaller groups. We go next to phylum, and then class, order, family, genus, and then finally we get down to the species level, where we're looking at an individual species. So in the case of humans, we're Homo sapiens. We're in the genus Homo. Our species is Homo sapiens, though. And when we're talking about this classification system, we use what's known as a binomial nomenclature. So they have these often hard to pronounce, arcane Latin-based names, but it's a way of preserving integrity in the naming system for different organisms, because common names are varied and challenging throughout the world. So science has adopted this Latin system of binomial nomenclature, or binomial two-naming system, where scientists use these names as the sort of scientific standard for developing where these organisms fall within this classification scheme. When we're utilizing these names for classification, we can break these classification systems out into these what are called phylogenetic trees, where we can build these relationships between organisms. The example they give in the textbook is looking at ape species and how closely different apes are related to one another. So we can see that, for example, humans and bonobos and chimpanzees are very closely related, where we have gibbons on the other side, which are not closely related. And these sorts of trees are built for plant species all the time as well. So building these understandings of the relationships between organisms is true and useful regardless of what type of organism we're looking for. It doesn't have to be animals, but plants are very useful, or I'm sorry, these trees are very useful for developing these relationship patterns in plants as well. We build these trees by really looking at how similar organisms are to one another. So do they share characteristics? That's not a foolproof way to sort of build these trees, but historically that's how these trees have been built. So if you were a scientist 100 years ago trying to develop a family tree of organisms, and you were looking at just strictly the physical characteristics or maybe some rudimentary biochemistry of an organism, you could very well misidentify which groups these species belong to. But when we have the advent of DNA technology and sequencing availability in the latter half of the last century, we really have built this sort of renaissance of systematics where researchers can use molecular tools to really finally parse out which organisms are closely related or how they're related to one another. And the use of genetic techniques has sort of really opened up the field of taxonomy. So if you're interested in that sort of work, that's a great sort of rabbit hole to go down to, because utilization of these molecular tools has really made for robust study of family relationships, which in plants can be very complex and convoluted. And so some of the more interesting family studies in these with molecular systematics come from the field of plant biology. So it's an interesting field, and it's one of these sort of leading edge uses of genetic technology to help build our understanding of how organisms are closely or not closely related to one another. That pretty much takes us through Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is pretty short, but an important sort of introductory chapter to the ideas of taxonomy. Chapter 13 is where this book sort of starts talking about the specific taxonomical relationships that we see with organisms, and they start out, not surprisingly, at the most primitive organisms. And it's important to have a basic understanding of these prokaryotic organisms, even in a class specifically looking at plant biology, because the interactions between plants and bacteria and other prokaryotes is important considerations, and it helps build understanding of how the evolutionary processes on this planet took shape to sort of over time build up these different traits and within these family groups that then we see as the diversity around us. So when we're looking at these prokaryotic groups, we're looking mainly at two main groups, the bacteria and the archaea. The archaea are not so important to this class because they really are isolated in these very extreme environments. They tend to, require really high temperatures, or they can eat poisonous gas or something like that. However, the bacteria are an important group, and they really play some significant roles in plant health, plant biology, and we even see the development of photosynthesis within these early prokaryotic organisms, which gets sort of co-opted into plants later on. One of the really interesting components of these early forms of photosynthetic life is this concept of what's known as endosymbiosis, where we have this process whereby eukaryotic cells were sort of accumulating these organelles as small independent bacteria with these traits that they found beneficial, and over time they've evolved to sort of collect these different organisms and incorporate them into their own biology. And so endosymbiotic theory is an important concept when we're looking at the development of the evolutionary pathways for these eukaryotic cells that eventually become plants. Mitochondria as well followed this same sort of path as chloroplasts, which allows for aerobic respiration, which is necessary for plant life. Figure 13.12 has a really nice description of sort of what the prevailing thought today is on endosymbiotic theory, and it's really a fascinating sort of subject. Moving through this chapter, though, we're going to look at these organisms. The next group of organisms we're talking about are what are known as protists. The protists are probably one of the more lesser known groups of organisms, but they are important because, again, we're going to see photosynthesis as a trait in some protists. Most protists aren't photosynthetic, but many of them are as well. One of the interesting things about the group called the protists is that it's kind of a garbage bin term. It's not like plants where you can say, all right, all plants have these sorts of traits, or all animals have these sorts of traits. All fungi have these traits. Protists are different. If it's not clearly a plant, it's not clearly an animal, and it's not clearly a fungus, but it's eukaryotic, it's probably just going to get sort of thrown into this bin that we call the protists. And so protists are an interesting group, and they're a very, very diverse group with very few rules governing sort of what organisms are going to fit within this group. Protists are, there's a huge diversity within the protists. Where they really come into play with plants, though, are as parasites. So if you are familiar with the potato famine that caused mass exodus of people from the country of Ireland, that was caused by a protist destroying potato crops. And when you had a population that was really reliant on a single crop like potatoes, the introduction of this protist, which wiped out the crops, caused massive social shifts. So we definitely see protists as very, very important plant pathogens. And so protists are not to be ignored. They're also really important in the decomposition of dead materials. So your compost bin is going to be very full of protists. Fungi are the next group that we talk about. And again, fungi are not plants. They're in an entirely different kingdom, but they are sort of reserved within this plant biology class sort of as a historical anachronism, because they sort of used to be closely thought of as closely related to plants because superficially they share some characteristics. The reality is that fungi are actually much closer related to animals than they are to plants. But fungi are also important in an ecological sense for plants, because one of the really key important roles that fungi play is this role of developing what are called mycorrhizal associations. These are symbiotic relationships that plants and fungi form in soils so that the fungi gets access to sugars from the plant, and the plant then gets access to usually phosphorus, but other micronutrients that fungi are pretty good at breaking down from soils that plants are not very good. So the mycorrhizal associations that we see with these plants and fungi are critical in many different plant systems, especially agricultural systems and things like that. Fungi are not to be ignored. Fungi also are pathogens and can cause rot and disease in many different plant species. So fungi, protists are important when we're looking at plant biology because they play these sort of ancillary roles where they are living in some sort of relationship with plants, and they also can tell us a bit about the evolutionary history of these plant systems as well, if we can track these evolutionary changes of organisms through time. All right, kind of a short lecture today. So pick out the information that's really heavily plant related in these two chapters, but we're going to continue on next week looking at plant systematics. So have a good understanding of how systematics works so that next week we can start looking at actual plant systematics. All right, we'll talk at you later.